I am Øyvind Isene. I work as a consultant for a company called Cisco in Oslo. Obviously, didn't spend much time on coming up with a good name, but that's how it is now. I'm an Oracle ace. My background is like an Oracle DBA. I love the Oracle database, but the database is becoming better and better, so it takes care of itself. When I started with Oracle at the University of Oslo, there was a running joke: if you could install it, you were qualified for a job in the Oracle core group. But that's a long time ago. And now it's so easy that everybody can run an Oracle database. So I've been moving into development recently, but in my soul, I'm still a DBA, I think. I'm not sure. I'm pretty done with this working during the night with operation stuff, and that's some of the background for this presentation. So I've been a DBA among developers for the last 6 years in different projects. They called it DevOps, but because it was not really a DevOps thing. It was just I was a DBA for hire, working together with the developers, so they can get to me to ask for help, and I could fix things even in the production database because I had full access. So I learned a lot about how developers think, and so on. I think my favorite subject is still optimization, what someone called tuning. I'm a big fan of Carey Millsap and Method R. That's the reason why I have this t-shirt. I can help you trace it. Troubleshooting in general, so on. I like to look for trouble. Not that I'm after a fight, of course, but I look for trouble that other people have made and try to avoid them running into production. So this presentation is a bit about explaining different mindsets. As I said, I was doing more development now, and I actually like development. I like Apex and PL SQL. Lately, I've been programming in Python and Kafka and having fun with different open APIs. Very good stuff. One thing I would like to say is development is not just coding. If you are a developer using some tool, if you make something, you're a developer. If you even use a graphical tool and make something funny in business intelligence, whatever, you're a developer. And there's a common mindset between different developers. So the agenda for this presentation is basically a complaint about developers. That should be you. And I'm going to try to justify the complaints and show you what I do or what my colleagues could do or what you can do, since they don't care. No, please interrupt me and disagree with me and laugh if you think I'm completely stupid or otherwise. I'm not really trying to start a flame war. I just want to tell you, if you could just understand how it is to inherit some, sorry, not crap, but something you've made, and you disappear and we have to take care of it. If you want to go now, just remember this slide. This is actually the essence of the whole thing. Someone has got a bright idea. It might be yours or somebody else's, and you are a developer who's making something out of it. But sooner or later, it enters into release and production. Then it's when operation takes over from now and all eternity, which in IT business means about 10, 20 years. So I think that's the difference here. We have a very different mindset, and that explains why some DBAs, some people from operation, are so kind of we may even reject a lot of things you don't understand because we are afraid of inheriting something that will give us a lot of problem. So if I should describe them, I think of them as creative. They like shiny things, sort of impatient, and I wonder if ITIL, by the way, do you know what that is? Yeah. Sometimes I wonder myself, it's the work of the devil. If you need an excuse, you don't want to deploy on Friday, you have ITIL to rescue. Ask for a change request or whatever. Persistent storage is something we hear from developers. What the? That's sort of, it's a database. It's not a persistent storage. But when people talk about persistent storage but refuse to relate to the database and We talk about schema and read, which basically means I don't want to work with it now, I'm going to worry about it later. Persistence and storage, so on. It's tempting to ask them to go and swim in a data lake. But we, on the other hand, we don't like to be called 2 a.m. That's how we are. And boring is good. We quite often have too many systems and too many users to please. And we don't really have time for manual tasks. If you make something that just needs a little bit tweaking to make it run once in a while, just remember that if we have responsibility for 1,000 of those things, we will have a lot of manual work. We worried about security, scalability, and uptime. Because if something is wrong with anything of this, we are the one who gets the blame. Because the people who made it, they are long gone. But my point is that it doesn't have to be this way. I think that operations, that means database administrator, Unix admins, whatever, they have something to learn from developers. One thing that developers are doing well is that they can sometimes focus on one task. Some talk about getting into the zone and work really well. That's a good thing. If you want to have a good book tip, there's a work called the Deep Work that talks about this. It's a good thing that developers do. Focus on one thing, while we DBAs, we tend to develop some kind of HD. We have a problem paying attention to a thing for a long time. And I think my fellow DBAs should learn more about coding, shell scripts, whatever, and be more creative. If they're creative, they can find new ways to automate, for instance. So the question is, can developers learn something from DBAs? And I think absolutely, or I wouldn't be here. Part of reality is known to developers. Developers quite often are specialized in one field. And I hope I'm not insulting any of you, but sometimes you are less exposed to the entire architecture. And I think that it's the nature of DBAs that we know what works and what doesn't. We have this experience. We have received a lot of things, and we know what you can trust. So to use a quote from Donald Knuth, beware of the bugs in the above code. I have only proved it correct, not tried it. And that is how many people feel in operations. Okay, that was an introduction. Now moving on to the first frustration. No data model. Just sit down for a think first. This is when grown-ups sit down for a coffee and perhaps a beer, if you work late, and just started drawing some squares and connections and have a think about those relationships. So what were they thinking, the developers? Quite often I see projects where there's no data model, so they haven't been thinking at all. If you have a data model, it proves that you have spent time trying to understand the universe you're going to work with, or domain as they call it. This is a good time to meditate over expressions, especially those abstract expressions you don't understand. If you create a data model, you can clarify your thought, you agree on a common map, and so on. So I use a data model as a way to communicate with normal people. The concept of a data model is actually very simple, and that's why people maybe think it's not necessary. But do it anyway. It could be that you have a language that is a bit different from your customer, for instance, or your end user. And the thing is that a data model, working on it, gives you an opportunity to fail early because you actually discover that there are some misconceptions out there. And a data model is a very important part of the documentation. So I'm sure you have know about the company Python. I really like their slogan, "Love your data," because that's what it's all about. We want to avoid getting crappy data into the database because there will be a lot of much less work later on. Now I work with a lot of data scientists, and we spend an awful amount of time cleaning up data. If you do a good job in data modeling in your production, in your data, in your system, which will eventually be a source for data in an analytic project later on, you will save a lot of money later on too. This drawing is just an illustration that applications come and go. People want new shiny stuff, so you have to throw them away, but the data they lives on somewhere. Nobody wants to get rid of the data they've been collecting for many years. How many of you are using an ORM or Hibernate or whatever? Yeah. They are very useful, and I don't agree with all these DBAs that hate Hibernate just because it's given them a lot of problem. But sometimes it's not the best solution. One thing I keep coming back to is that sometimes you have a complex system and you can just replace it with a small piece of code in the database, just like Frank showed in last session. And if you download this presentation later, you can click on this link and you have a discussion by Gavin King, who actually made Hibernate, and where it tells you to learn SQL. It's a very good advice, actually. So one myth that I hear once in a while is that constraints, the stuff you put into a data model, leads to bad performance. Well, in my world, in the Oracle database, that is absolutely not true. Rather contrary, what you put into your data model is extra information for the optimizer, which it uses to find a more efficient path through the data. It is remarkable how good this is. So if you hear that, question it. Okay, so this presentation is a bit Oracle biased. Can I ask you, who of you work with a database that is not Oracle? Okay, from the statistics, I reckon it's MySQL or SQL Server or whatever. A lot of the things I'm saying here can be just as well applied to other databases, because even Spark SQL has an engine to find a way through your data. So this is a great book. If you're anyway involved with Oracle database, this is a good book, very practical on how to use the best tool for this thing, namely the Oracle SQL Developer Data Modeler. Haley, she's a fantastic speaker, and she really explains these things well in this book. So get it or get it to someone else. So just to sum up, I think one should demand a data model as soon as possible. Look for the usual stuff: primary key, unique, and foreign keys. If you have been to the university and learn about all the degrees of normalization, all the stuff, don't worry, because if you can just get the basics in, you are far ahead of a lot of other people. If you're a DBA or, I think that the DBAs, the people, they should be helping to get a SQL Developer data model up and running. Sometimes it's a bit, there are a few things that might be annoying, but anyway. Second thing is security. I used to joke and say that two things that can ruin my day, it's Oracle licenses and security. I don't think I had anything about security at university, but it's been on the agenda for a while. So Connor McDonald, a very smart guy now in Oracle, he says that security is the new high availability. That means that people will actually forgive you if your system is down for a few hours, but they are not likely to forgive you if you lose their personal data. Point is that security is really boring. It's impossible to make security sexy, I think. But it's a feature, and it's necessary. For instance, does your application collect sensitive data? that can be identified during data modeling. And I think that security must be a proper activity in the project. If you want to really bother the project manager, which I sometimes call the proxy, ask him about security, because he should make sure that security is part of the project. So you have sensitive data and personally identifiable information, PII. This is very relevant now in these GDPR times. Point is that if you use SQL Data Modeler, there's a field there to tag or mark that data is sensitive. So you get a lot of things for free when you just start right from the start. And you can get a really easy report of this is what I have. Now I'm in a project where I help a rather big public customer in Norway to map out, look for sensitive data in all their applications. So it's a lot of work. Yeah, audit logs. They are very useful after a data theft. I hope you will never have that experience, but the thing is that you cannot audit every action that is happening on your system, because then you will have way too much audits to go through. There you have another reason to identify sensitive data. Encryption is something else that people misunderstand. Encryption basically means that you can't read it when it's encrypted. So you encrypt stuff that is stored on disk or wherever, or in transit. But obviously you cannot show encrypted data to people. They won't be able to understand it by nature. So you have to decrypt it sometimes. And that's where you have a problem, possibly. SQL injection, do you know what that is? SQL injection happens when you start gluing statements together, where you take something from a user interface and you glue it to the end of an already SQL statements and send it to the database. Hackers understand that they can also put, instead of a number or name into that field, they can add SQL syntax and have that executed. It's surprising that this is still a problem, but it is. If you haven't heard about a SQL injection and you work with SQL, look it up. So, as I said, I think security is sometimes a burden. You don't get many friends by denying access. And I don't think it should be only a burden for the DBA, because this is just another thing that makes the DBA unpopular, and I think they are already enough unpopular. Could be a burden for the project manager. Thing is that security shouldn't be the responsibility of one person alone. You have to bring it up to everybody, so everybody has some consciousness about it. But I think it's safe to say that we DBAs or people in operation worry more about the security and other people. Yeah. So where should we implement security? I think we should implement it as close to the data as possible, meaning in the database. And it is, of course, okay to implement security in layers. But if you only do it in application and that application gets replaced by something else, then you might be exposed. So trying to hide an open database behind firewalls is not a good idea. Just Google for people who has hacked into open MongoDBs, open Elasticsearch stuff. It's a sad story. So to sum up this part, ask for a data model. Ask for an assessment of sensitive data. Maybe you should have repeating reviews during the implementation if you're part of a bigger project. For DBAs or anybody in operation, it's a good tip that Oracle has actually made a tool for you to sort of assess security in your database. I just mentioned it there, but I'm not going to talk about it. So the third thing is not using the Oracle documentation. And of course, you can replace Oracle with your database. But this is still surprising how people Google for absolutely everything. I have been asked to help people with SQL syntax. They couldn't make it work. And I have looked at, I'm looking at the page there. they found on Google, and it's for another database. You know, SQL is SQL, but they implement a few things differently. So the syntax for some Java database the guy had found didn't work on our database. And yeah, I like bookmarks to the manual. And sometimes it's about studying, not always getting a quick answer. So the following slides might seem a bit boring if you're not really working close to the Oracle database, but I think you can see that this is, you have something similar for all the database. So for a DBA, the most important, for an Oracle DBA, the most important manual is the concept manual. It just basically shows how the Oracle database is built up, the important parts, things you absolutely should not mess with, and so on. And Tom Kite said that if you read this manual, remember 10% of this manual, you know more than most people. So if you're a developer and you really want to pick a fight with the DBA, you can ask him, have you read the Oracle concept manual? And there you go. Another one is the database development guide. There's a lot of really useful information there, how to get the best out of a database when you're a developer. There's like, sometimes we get slow performing SQL statement just because silly things like messing with data types. Same thing in two tables, different data types, and the index is not being used. Locking is a classic, indexing, PL SQL. Lots of useful information there. And if you work with Postgres, MySQL, SQL Server, I'm sure that you find similar information. Go look for it. This is another one, database new features guide. Point is that new features, you know, they didn't exist before. Yeah. So obviously you can't know about things that didn't exist. So you need to get to know them. You can go to a conference, but reading the new features guide is actually quite useful because you can't Google what you don't know. This is another one. I've seen people implement stuff in their code that looks tons of code, right? And Oracle has already a package for it. If you use that package instead, you get two things. It runs in the database. You don't have all the traffic from your application into the database. It's been used by many, means it's tested and probably has a fewer bugs than your code. So what I do sometimes is to have a look at this manual to see if I can replace code in an application with standard calls to these standard packages. Very useful. Obviously, the SQL language reference is a must. I think it's faster for me to look up in the SQL reference manual now that I know it. But it's also a good thing to just look back and see if you miss something. The select statements has become pretty huge now, and it's impossible to master all of it seems. But there's a few gems there you can use to speed up your code and so on. PL SQL language reference, I'm not going to get into that. This is another guide for tuning. When it comes to optimization and tuning, there's a lot of talk about best practice, and people, I mean, Googling solutions in the Oracle world is dangerous because you're most likely to get up some really bad advices. If you want to have a talk with the DBA about that, just mention that topic, and it's an internal joke in the Oracle community. But read it, because there you get some good advice on tuning. There are other special guides, of course, if you do data warehousing, wherever. So the question is, can you trust what Google finds for you? Obviously not, because you really can't know if you haven't read the documentation or learned it from some trustworthy source. So I think the DBA should be better at know about the documentation, talk about it, docs.oracle.com. It's obvious, but a lot of people don't know about it. They prefer Googling. Just send them the link, maybe have an introduction to the documentation set, and so on. Yeah. So this is another one, confusing DevOps with operations. I like the DevOps idea, but honestly, there's much more in operation than DevOps. We are afraid of being hacked, and we are afraid of losing our data, And I think that if you're only playing with Docker, you might not have understood the fear of losing data. So what we do is a little bit more than creating a few containers. We worry about availability, network. We have a complex architecture. We have end users that call us when the developers are gone. We have patching and upgrades, backup and restore. By the way, all this boring work is a good reason to go to the cloud. That is why I actually love the cloud idea, not because I'm being brainwashed, but I honestly don't miss this patching and backup and restore thing. So I just found a definition from Wikipedia about DevOps, and if this is actually done right, I'm pretty happy. But in production means that people depend on it. It's useful, right? And it also means the data being collected usually has some value. We don't want to lose it. Company has gone bankrupt because they lost the data. When these Twin Towers crashed some years ago in New York, people went bankrupt because the disaster database, how do you say, the backup database, the standby database was in the other tower. So they had nothing left, and they went bankrupt within a month. Another thing is that there's not enough testing. Testing is very popular. There's been given presentation about it. And it's usually right, but volume testing tends to be a bit too complicated, too boring, so we skip that part, and therefore we don't know what will happen when all those users come in and use your system. So this is a bit sarcastic, but sometimes I wonder if the developers use their own applications. Small hiccups accumulate over time. They cause big problems. The only thing we ask for is actually no manual intervention in production, meaningful error messages, and that's been tested for real-world scenarios. You are awfully quiet. Are you either sleeping or are you bored, or nobody disagree with me? I can't believe you. Okay. So this is about attention span redux. I think it's not a nice thing to say CV-driven development, but sometimes I actually worked for a customer where they said that they were basically just using what looked fine on the CV and the whole system. This was an old system for telecom industry, and I was working on it in Brazil, and it was a mess. It was like the Amazon, a complete jungle with stuff. The thing is that, as I said, we usually have to. It's too expensive to create a new system, right? A big system that used by many. So those systems of today become a legacy system tomorrow, but we will have to use them for many years, and they last for years. So I thought I could take just one off topic. Can I ask you, how many of you love architects? No one. So this is a picture from Oracle Technology Network. They have replaced this. But I realized that you have Java developers, database admins, and so on. They're all working, but this guy is just sitting there and smiling. And that's my impression of architects too. They are usually people who got bored of programming and doing real work, so they just go to Gartner conferences and figure out what's cool this year, and they pester everybody with their silly ideas. So this is the last thing, and this is really stupid simple. There are some really basic, really simple concepts in this world that people seem to forget in all their complexity. Latency, for instance, it means late, right? Things takes time. Simple math. If you have a small operation and repeat it enough times, it will start to take a lot of time. So if you were in the presentation Frank gave before me, he talked about this communication between the application, the client, and the database server, and it takes time to do a context switch and all that stuff, and that is very important. There's a lot of applications that are very slow just because of this. I went to a customer in Sweden. Well, I'm from Norway, and this pure customer in Sweden is a utility company. They're using a Norwegian-made software. The point is that this customer is larger than the 3 biggest customers in Norway. And they have a query. The poor end user starts a query on her computer, and the computer seems to freeze for 12 minutes. And of course, they blame the database. The poor DBA on site gets the burden of proof, and it's the Exadata, because these problems start happening when they move to Exadata. Poor guy. He was the one guy who actually recommended Exadata, so he was in shit, to be honest. So what I did, we agreed to have a test. We took notes on when the operation started, and I enabled what is called SQL Extended Trace on the session, and we recorded everything. And after that, we saw that there were two distinct SQL statements. Both of those two SQL statements were executed 58,000 times during 10 minutes. Each time it took 330 microseconds. There's nothing you can do when it takes 330 microseconds. The design flaw is obviously that these guys in Norway have designed this, that they sent close to 120,000 SQL statements over the network. So there was absolutely nothing physically. If you could make the database vanish, it will still take a lot of time. And the whole explanation is latency. There's nothing that runs in 0 time. Which means that microservices are a very good idea, but sometimes it's not always the fastest approach. Just like in some projects, you have people that take a small part and implement it in C because they want it to run real fast. There's a trade balance here. So a classic beginner's trap is that people who want to code, they don't want to learn SQL, but they learn enough to send a select statement to the database that returns 10,000 rows. And in their program, in their PHP application, they generate an update statement for each of those rows, and you get like 10,000 plus 1 round trips. This could have been done in less than a second with one update statement. So the speed of light is about 300,000 kilometers per second. That is really fast, isn't it? But as Frank showed us very nicely in the previous session, there's a limit how much you can do within the time window, which is the patience of your end users. I mean, having to wait a long time for a report or something silly is simply not acceptable. And it doesn't help if you call up the DBA and the DBA checks the database and say, well, everything looks fine here. So in this game, it's not only the developers, it's both sides. So it gets down to this response time. The user wants an answer in 5 seconds or something like that. Or even less if it's a web page. How much can you do that? I have been working with developers in a data warehouse project that ask the database to sort 300 gigabytes of data. Well, that's not difficult for a database, but if you have a small amount of RAM and it spills onto disk, this starts taking time. And these round trips between application and database can easily become a big problem, even if they are very close to each other. Another thing is this called best practice. There is no such thing. Sorry for keeping this up. What happens is that someone in their good faith want to give you recommendations, right? So they make some assumption of your nature, and they come up with some recommendation, and the marketing department call it best practice. The lazy guys in the big consultant company, it's already made, we don't have to think, we just copy and say to the customer, we are following best practices. And there you go, nobody used brain power, and you end up with something really stupid. There's a lot of bad practices you can warn about. There's a lot of good practices you can recommend. But whenever I hear somebody says best practice, I think, here I have a person in front of me who doesn't use his brain very much. And no idea about volume. As I said, sorting data takes time. If you do something that works very well on your computer, you have a small test data set or whatever, of course it is fast, because it might even fit in some small cache you have. But you have to ask, will this scale on a larger data set? Will it work in production? So here's a few slightly more advanced concepts. I see I have about 11, 12 minutes left. depending how much you want to pester with an intelligent question. But I'm just kidding. Transactions. That's it sounds complicated, right? But if you move money from one account into another, you should commit after you're already done with the whole transaction, not in the middle. But there's people who commit at random times just to improve performance, and if you do that, you are in for really big problems later. The thing with transactions in database is that it is the most important thing in the database, because you don't want to end up with data that are plain wrong, right? So Oracle and all the other good databases, they do a lot of stuff to make sure this is right. And Oracle has done this fantastic, actually from I was like 15 years old or something, they had a row locking in the database. And if you do this, follow the recommendations well, it works very well. But there's a warning here. If you come from one database and you think you've understood in one database and you move over to another, in SQL Server, for instance, they have implemented what they call the dirty reads to improve performance. There's no need for that in Oracle. And if you try to do all these tricks, you are most likely going to run into more problems. So, and then another quote from Donald Knuth, sometimes we try to optimize things prematurely. We imagine problems and we do things because we think this is how it has to be done, but it might not be like this. So don't try to be smarter than the database when it comes to locking. Just follow a simple logic and don't apply random locks and so on. So there are people who think that a writer will, if you update data, that will block people querying the data, but it's not. There's no such thing in this database. And if you read data, it won't lock another reader and so on. And this is actually why you pay an awful lot of money for the Oracle database. So these things, they work actually quite well when you follow the rules. Multiversioning is something along this same theme. The thing is that you want to get a consistent answer anytime. And you can run a query whenever you want. It won't be blocked by updates in the database, because if that was the case, the database will be practical and usable. I mean, you couldn't use an Oracle database in a bank if that was the case. And Oracle can really serve many sessions that have started up. Read and do. I can't really expect people to understand read and do, perhaps if you're a developer and busy with Java or something else, but it's a core project in the Oracle database, and I've seen many projects where even the DBA didn't understand these things, and they end up with a very slow system. So to sum up this boring subject, measure everything. I guess most of you are exposed to that as developer, because it's becoming very popular talking about observability, which is not quite the same thing, but instrumentation and tracing in the data is very important. If you want to know more about it, this is probably the best book on the subject. And again, if you're a developer and want to pester your DBA, you can ask them if they have read this book. So I have a bonus frustration for you. Releases. It really surprises me how much problem this has caused us. What goes wrong? Not enough testing, and production is not the same as develop and quality assessment. Thing is that I see that many places, DBA, even DBAs, they don't help much with making new environments for the developers so they can have access to the whole database and see what's going on. And so I don't know, maybe the data is out of date or something, so the developers has to try to relate to a database that is not the same as production. So it worked fine in development, but once you put it into release, it stops working because it's too different. So I think that a DBA should get involved early. And this is not something I say to the developers. I try to tell my fellow DBAs that you can't just wait until the system is ready for release, you just have to get involved and offer help as soon as possible. We have, so here's a slide on Liquibase. Personally, we have used a very simple tool. It's called Flyway. The only reason why I introduced, I'm writing Flybase, but that's wrong. It's Flyway. Sorry, I'll correct the slide. Anyway, so Flyway is a very simple tool. So you submit SQL scripts for release into Git or wherever, and you check it out, and then you run a command. The scripts are sent to the database. It computes a checksum of the script, so it makes sure that you cannot go in and hack your script and cause problems later. And the reason I introduced that for the customer is that in a project, the DBAs were asked to run every script manually with SQL+, and they have to give a username and password maybe 70 times during a release. It was probably not according to some Genova convention. So I asked them to use, we started to use Flyway. Liquibase is a bit more complex, and very soon, if it's not already, it will be integrated into SQL Developer, and this will probably help you with managing releases in relation to database. So I have like 5 minutes left, so I should go very fast over this. This is an alternative career for DBAs who give up. The point is that a database will heal itself. And I'm not sure if they will deal with developers too, but there will be less work for DBAs in the future, and there is now a higher demand for people who can work with security, data science, and so on. And you can always start brewing beer. So I added some slides for these conferences because, I know that I'm among developers, so I do understand that developers has many frustrated situations with DBAs. So here's a few slides for the other side. So somebody asked, does DBA means don't bother asking? My point is that the DBAs are far from innocent. I think one of my biggest frustration is that a lot of DBAs has a complete lack of empathy and communication skills. They come with statements saying this as if it was very obvious, but if it's so obvious, why can't you explain it? If you can't teach how things work, that's something that really frustrates me, and I do understand why developers just want to move everything to the cloud so they don't have to bother with operations anymore. Being right is one thing, but actually win people over to your side is something else. And again, you have the lack of involvement. I think DBA should be better at offering help, talk to end users and developers. And they have all this experience, right, of what works and what doesn't. Just learn from the developers and identify anti-patterns. Try to be an active part in the projects. As I said, just don't wait until you receive the stuff in your data center. One problem that a lot of DBAs, they refuse to give access to important views in the Oracle database where the developer can see what's going on. Some of these views actually requires DBA role. But honestly, in these days, when you have Docker isolated environment, there's no risk in giving system access to a developer. I hope certainly you have better control of the infrastructure than that. And if your DBA doesn't want to help you, if you need access to an Oracle database for test environment, there's a lot of stuff, and you can how to do that. Gerald Wenzel is a really cool guy in Oracle who has done a lot of work on how to easily create an Oracle database in Docker and VirtualBox and so on. Get in touch if you want to have some advice. My point is that the DBA should do everything they can to help the developers to see what's going on in the database. This is sort of sensitive data that is usually restricted in production, but in development obviously doesn't hurt anybody. So in some DBAs, maybe it's because we are all getting old. As Mogens Nørgaard said, we will die with our customers. Oracle database hasn't been cool for many years. And there's always a lot of work to do. So sometimes we keep doing the same things over and over again, and we don't realize that the world is changing around us. There is more than JDBC. A lot of DBAs do not know about Oracle REST data services that can really modernize your database and make access to your data much easier. And I think they should really look into how can we improve the release routines. Okay, now my time is actually up in 1 minute. So, don't even know SQL. I'm surprised how many DBAs said they don't know SQL. I mean, how did you get the job in the first place? But if the data are so valuable, you should be more available to help people get the value out of the data. So my best advice is, here's the last slide, the second last. I really like this conference. I learned a lot. And you can read a lot of documentation. You can hear a lot of stuff from marketing. But there's nothing better than talking to your colleagues and people from other places about what works and not work. Another thing I actually like with the Oracle conferences is that I meet a lot of really smart Oracle project managers. And when I talk to them, like one-on-one, they understand that I'm not going to use what they say against them. I do get a lot of useful tip. So, yeah, conference is a good thing. Get involved, get some empathy, and prove yourself wrong. Thank you.